In a way, it's too bad we have this constraint because this is going to be a wonderful event. We have been cooperating with USAID and IHC and other sponsors, Cities Alliance, the World Bank, in this is the second annual competition for graduate student papers on urban issues. And I think as you're about to hear, be sure to pick up one of the books which contains all of the papers. And we have with us three of the authors who are going to present their work, and it'll be commentated on by some very distinguished specialists. And it's really exciting. I think clearly there are, I think the title is A New Generation of Ideas. It's not just a new generation of ideas, it's a new generation of people. And I think for veterans of urban studies and people who worried about issues, say, of urban poverty and urbanization and metropolitan development over the last 30, 40 years, there were moments when we all despaired that anybody really cared. Well, clearly when you take a look at the 70 papers that were submitted to this competition, there are a lot of people out there, there's new energy, and there are new ideas, and you'll hear some of them today. We're going to have, in a moment I'm going to ask Susan Hill, President and CEO of the International Housing Coalition, to say a few words of welcome, and then we'll go right to 3 sets of presentations. Each speaker has been told that he or she has 8 minutes, which is not a lot, and I'm going to try to hold people to that limit. And we're going to do all the presentations first so that everybody has a comfortable amount of time for his or her presentation, and then hopefully we'll have time left for discussion. And promptly at 10:50, you'll hear from Jessica Rosen, who is Acting Director of the Office of Infrastructure and Engineering at USAID, so we can wrap up at 11. Because at 11, there are security people who are going to come in and start sweeping the room, and they'll sweep you out even if you don't want to go. So with that, Susan, please.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Susan Hill. I'm with the International Housing Coalition, and I don't have too much to add, actually, to what Blair just said. We're really happy that you're here. We're really happy our students are here today. The International Housing Coalition has partnered with USAID and Cities Alliance and the Woodrow Wilson Center to and the World Bank, I think, also help support this to run this competition over the course of the last year. And we're really happy to be to help encourage students thinking about these issues and working on these issues. And as Blair mentioned, the next generation of ideas. And we're really happy to be a part of that. I also want to mention that the Leonard P. Ream Foundation helped sponsor this event, and we're very grateful to their contribution because they provided the funding for the students to actually come here today and be a part of this. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to the students and the panelists. I'm really excited to hear from each of you and to hear all of the great ideas that are going to be discussed today.
Great, thank you. First, we'll ask Fatima Wajahat and Billy Cobbett to come up and join us. I'm not going to go through the bios. There's a handout with biographical information you can check on. And this, Fatima's paper is The Importance of Tenure Security in Home Improvement and Squatter Settlements. The floor is now yours.
Thank you. My name's Fatima. I'm from the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at Florida State University. I'd like to thank the Center for holding this competition, for inviting me to speak here. I'm talking about the city of Lahore. It's the second largest city in Pakistan, a population of approximately 7 million people, has about, according to official records, 350 squatter settlements, and a rate of urbanization of 3.1%. I'll quickly go over my research question, which is primarily the link between home improvement in a squatter settlement and tenure security. So what role does tenure regularization play in improving in home improvement in a squatter settlement, and how do different kinds of tenure security arrangements affect home improvement. And in order to understand these questions, I looked at the theory that informs or governs this study area. There are two theories, and they're divergent. So the first theory suggests, and it's propagated by Hernando de Soto and is actively bought into by international development organizations, and that is that tenure security is contingent on property rights. And unless a resident has property rights, home improvement will not be unleashed. He or she will not have the incentive to go ahead and improve the homes. And so in order to achieve home improvement and squatter settlement upgrading, it's important to have property titles. The other side of the argument is, and it's propagated by a few researchers and academics, that tenure security is based on the perception of security by a resident. And housing improvement will occur when a resident has that perception of security, regardless of what the legal tenure status is. So things like issuing a national ID card, or getting mail at their residence, or the government conducting a census review. All of that leads to a perception of security, and residents would improve their homes according to their savings and their disposable income. I looked at a squatter settlement in Lahore to see to answer these research questions and to see what theory better speaks to the experience of squatter settlements in Lahore. Now, this settlement, I'll quickly go over it. It was first inhabited in the 1970s. It was regularized in 2004, had approximately 200 households in 2008. Then the government constructed a highway around the city, and it went right through the settlement, so 100 houses were taken out. Now it's about 100 households, and it is regularized. But what we still see within the settlement is a range of tenure security arrangements. There are residents that have chosen not to go ahead and buy the title or to get the title, and there are residents that have chosen to do so, and that decision was primarily based on their financial situation. So formal ownership, there is that tenure arrangement in the settlement. Then there are people that do have a property title but don't have formal access to basic services like water, gas, and electricity. And at the same time, there are people who don't have a title, but they do have access to basic services. So there are a range of tenure arrangements that exist within the settlement. Furthermore, the perception of security does not rest on the legal tenure status of the resident. What it does rest on is, number one, of course, the government's legalization process that started in 2004 helped create a perception of security. But other than that, the residents' contact with elected officials to pester them to give them basic services before 2004. And then later on, the government going ahead and providing them with electricity, water, and gas, all of that led to a perception of security. The number of residents itself, the larger the number, the more the perception of security. And the larger their number grew, the more they were able to lobby the elected officials, the more they were able to get attention from the officials. And they were able to come together in a self-help program by a non-government organization as well. So a lot of these things, the perception rested on their numbers and the neighborhood leader, who was considered as a caretaker. And when I asked the residents what was their perception, whether they felt secure in their homes, and most of them quickly responded that yes, we have our neighborhood leader, whose name was Muhammad Rashid. He would take care of us. He wouldn't let anything happen to us. So they had a perception of security regardless of whether they held a title or not. And those who did have a title were able to do so, were able to afford it with a lot of difficulty. Most of them chose not to go ahead and get a title because they felt that it was unaffordable. They've also felt that the government will do whatever it wants to do to whoever it wants, regardless of their legal tenure status. So it doesn't matter whether they have a title or not, and because it's unaffordable, they chose not to get one. Also, residents improved their homes incrementally over time through their personal savings, regardless of whether they had a title or not. And I'll quickly go over some pictures just to give you an idea what the settlement looks like. So it does have a system of sewage disposal, electricity, gas. This is the highway that went straight through the settlement in 2008. This is what some of the homes look like. And there are a range of income levels as well. So there's some very, very poor households, and then there's some low to middle low income houses. And they do have structural integrity, these homes. They're not semi-permanent. They're permanent structures that have been built incrementally over the last 30 years. So I'll quickly end with what needs to be done. My findings speak more to the second argument, that a title is not absolutely necessary to unleash home improvement. What is instead needed is a more flexible system of tenure regularization that is based on the residents' need of recognition of their tenure, their relationship to their land, rather than a piece of paper that they get through bureaucratic hurdles that they have to spend a lot of money on that they don't have, and then they're also they're exploited by the officials of the development authorities that are giving out those papers, those titles. So in the end, it seems like their perception of security rests on a number of things that are not directly linked to a property title, and what is needed is a recognition of their tenure arrangement, their relationship to the land, rather than providing them with a piece of paper that the state recognizes as their relationship to the land. So that's it.
Perfect. Right on time. Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Why don't you join us over here while William Cobbett addresses the
Thank
points
you very
raised?
much. Thank you, Fatima, for that presentation and for the great pleasure to be able to respond. Let me first of all respond in the general, because even though this is a subset of a city in Pakistan, what is captured in these essential lessons are globally significant and applicable lessons. So what we're seeing here, this is a snapshot of the global challenge that you advertised for this session, which is the rapid urbanization that is taking place primarily in secondary cities rather than in primary cities. The fact that the bulk of urbanization is still internal city growth. It's not rural to urban migration. But the headline for globally, and then of course focusing in on Pakistan, would be that for a variety of different reasons, and I'll just pick out three headline reasons. One, the scale of change, the pure numbers that we're talking about, which are, we always use the word unprecedented, but this would be accurate in this case. Secondly, the pace, which is what took place in Europe over 150 or 200 years, is taking place in 30 or 40 years in sub-Saharan Africa or in South Asia. And thirdly, and this is the context within which Fatima's paper is located, the policy response at the national and the local level, all three of which lead to the inexorable result. It's not a conclusion, but it's a fact on the ground that the bulk of urban growth in cities today is informal and will continue to be informal for the foreseeable future, which let us call the next 50 years. So that is a policy reality that residents have to deal with and local governments and national governments need to respond to. Now, implicit in my statement is that part of the problem is the policy response of governments, which tend not to welcome the urban poor to their cities, nor to make provision for them. So one of the headline policy lessons above the research of Fatima is that there is no forward planning by local or national governments. And so it is left for residents, and always the poorest residents, to make their own solutions, very often against the wishes of the local authorities. So that's the context within which I think her paper is located. So the issue of secure tenure is a very good focal point to have a look at the conditions. But I would also draw out issues that go beyond tenure, which affect tenure. One is the location, and that is that most urban settlements tend to be poorly located because of the policy failure, because of the lack of planning, because of the lack of a sympathetic response. The second relates and is associated with the lack of the provision of services, the lack of the provision of shelter. I would put services in the category of public good, local authority obligation, and shelter less so, where there's very clearly a response from the end user. And then last but not least, all of these people are in cities for reasons, and they are about livelihood before they're about shelter. And so it's also about access to employment and other services, not least of which would be health and education. So this is how cities are growing, have grown in Latin America, are growing in Africa and in Asia. And right at the middle of it is the challenge of this thing called secure tenure, which is the focus of Fatima's paper. I would stress that secure tenure is two words, and I want to separate the two. The one is the security, and that is where I like her argument that is not an absolute, but is very often down to the perception of the resident themselves as to what am I secure or am I not, is not necessarily a legal construct, but is an opinion. And so people can say, with this set of circumstances, I feel secure or I feel insecure. And then the second is the concept of tenure, which in the debate has become a very simple elision from tenure equals title, which is a point made many times before, but which continues to take place. Titling is one form of tenure security or tenure application in a range, and in many, many situations, certainly I would say for all of Africa and most of Asia, is the Rolls-Royce. It is the one least achievable in the short to the medium term, and is therefore often the least applicable and the least useful for the poor themselves. And this is a point often lost on academics and policymakers, because the reality is that most local authorities do not have the capacity to actually implement titling for all of the population, even if that was the decision of what should be done. And so that's why with the paper and the primary research that Fatima has brought to bear is so useful. In so doing, she also raises very interesting subtexts, which are, one, in all of this, we can talk about the nominal obligations of the local government. In reality, there are very objective limits to the ability of the local authority to deliver. And actually, one of the real policy challenges is often getting the state to recognize its limits and creating the space for people to be able to respond. And that's where the language she uses of the voter banks and the role of officials in providing patronage is where the grey area is, that to stay favorable with the voter banks, you have to be seen to be delivering. And that means direct delivery rather than enabling, which is actually possibly the more useful. But her essential conclusions, that title is unaffordable, but the subtext of Fatima's conclusion is very, very key, that title is not actually necessary. That you can achieve everything we're talking about, which is people's investments in their own future, formally recognized or at least tolerated by the local authority, is achievable without title, is a very significant conclusion, which has application and certainly is consistent with our own evidence all over the world. The second conclusion is a critical one as well. Governments can and do what they want when they want. And so the poor in this context are very much a political football, and that's where titling actually doesn't become critical. When they do mass evictions, they do not stop with those who've got title and those who are not. A mass eviction is a mass eviction, and it's a clearance. And what was interesting about the Shamaspura was that you had this mixture of houses with titling and some with not, some with services, and it was completely random. But the fact that you had this mosaic of different tenure forms, I think, gave ultimately the entire community protection. because it was a beehive, a honeycomb of different titling, and people could decide to take it or not to take it. And the last point is that the bulk of delivery around shelter is the people themselves. It's not the local authority. And so the policy messages for local governments, even in this research, are very, very clear, which is that of a new relationship between the urban poor and the local authority, of government backing off and creating the conditions which allow people with energy to solve their own solutions, but that does not abrogate the local authority from its own responsibilities. So I could go on for a long time, but I think I'm around about 8 minutes now.
You're exactly at 8
There we
minutes,
go.
so thank you.
It must have been the vibe I was with. Thank you very much,
Perfect.
Blair.
Thank you both very much, and we'll have you come back for the question and answer period. But next we're going to hear the second paper. Leslie Hoey and Anthony Kolb, please come up and join us. And Leslie, the floor is yours.
Hi, my name is Leslie Huey again. I'm a PhD student in city and regional planning at Cornell University. And I'll be talking about health aspects of urban poverty, but specifically about the challenges of implementing policies and programs in health in urban contexts. And this is an interesting case where you actually have a government that does want to respond to a very pressing need in health across the country. So I wanted to understand what the reality is once you actually launch a program, and a very ambitious one. This is focused in Bolivia on the national government's zero malnutrition program that was launched in 2007. And I'm essentially starting from a premise. I don't say this explicitly in my paper, but I am suggesting that there actually may be a rural bias, or at least an urban neglect, when it comes to healthcare, especially in countries that are now highly urbanized. And this is in contrast to the idea of the urban bias that we're often led to believe in a lot of development literature, at least until recently. And so I'm going to quickly go through 4 assumptions that underlie this idea of the urban bias and explain to you how my findings are beginning to question this. First, there's an assumption that for a number of different reasons, the population in urban areas is healthier. But what I was finding, at least in terms of malnutrition, is that there's much higher concentrations of malnutrition in urban areas in Bolivia, the 3 that I was looking at, than we were really led to believe, based on the way that national coordinators of the Zero Malnutrition Program were really thinking about malnutrition and how they were looking at the data. So on the left is how they were thinking about it. They looked at rural areas and found that about 33% of children are chronically malnourished, children under 5. And they were also looking at urban areas and only found about 12% of children there are malnourished. But if you take all of those children combined and look at absolute numbers, and you consider that now 66% of Bolivians are living in cities, this translates into around 44% of all of those children living in cities. So it begins to equalize the importance of focusing on not just rural areas, but also urban areas. But this program prioritized about 166 municipalities in the country, about half of the rural municipalities, and put all of its efforts and energy and time and incredible donor dollars into rural areas, launching some programs, especially in the health sector. It has many other components as well, nationally, so by default in urban areas, but not nearly giving urban areas the same attention as it was rural municipalities. Secondly, there's an assumption with this idea of the urban bias that cities are often allocated more resources. But what I was finding in Bolivia is that the reality is that a lot of the resources that cities have are not adequate for their population size. And this is particularly true in areas that are rapidly urbanizing, and especially when allocations are often based on censuses that aren't done for more than 10 years at a time. In Bolivia, the last one was done in 2001. And so the reality has shifted quite dramatically, and a lot of cities are not receiving the resources they really need. This just gives you a simple visual of how skewed these population ratios are. In one department I was looking at, the population in the rural areas on average is about 2,000 to every health worker, where in the city it's about 12,000. And there's some municipalities that only have 18 people per health worker. And new programs like the Zero Malnutrition Program aren't making things any better. They're often thinking about how they allocate their resources, which are very significant. They think of them equally. They often are sending one nutritionist to the city and one to each rural municipality. But this doesn't make any sense when you look at these kinds of population ratios. Thirdly, the urban bias idea has an assumption that decision makers will often be more responsive to cities because populations are closer to the administrative homes of programs and policies, at least at the regional level, if not at the central, closer to the central level, and also that healthcare workers are closer to their supervisors. But in Bolivia, what I was finding is that it really depends on the model that a policy or program has. And the Zero Malnutrition Program, for the most part, really had a very centralized decision-making structure, and it still does, and a fairly universal program model. So it was implementing interventions across the country that they expected to be implemented in a universal manner. And this really created a lot of frustration at the local level, especially in the urban sites I was looking at among health staff, who believed, at least had the perception, that they couldn't adapt any of these interventions to their reality, which was often very different from the rural municipalities, and didn't feel like they could voice their ideas for how to improve the program or at least explain the challenges that they were up against. Finally, there's a perception with this urban bias idea that populations in urban centers will have better access to quality care. But in the case of Bolivia, this is a prevention program, really trying to prevent malnutrition. And I think there might be something different going on with preventive types of healthcare, especially in urban context, where I was finding that a lot of the urban population really wasn't receiving this type of care for a number of different reasons. First, because in the cities, there's a much bigger mix of urban healthcare providers. It's not just the public healthcare system that directly links to the Ministry of Health. There's private healthcare, there's NGOs that are leading a lot of healthcare centers, and the biggest proportion of the population is attending these hospitals that are actually for government workers. And it essentially has a whole different system and structure and funding and supervising structure that the Ministry of Health often was really ignoring when they were launching these new programs. And so at least around 30% of the population attending these private NGOs and this public worker health insurance hospitals were not receiving micronutrients or nutrition counseling and many of the other interventions that this program was trying to integrate into the health system. Secondly, local staff I was talking to in these urban sites have an incredible number of competing health priorities that they're trying to address and programs. First, in large part, this was because the Zero Malnutrition Program on the far left was really implemented with a parallel program model, as were a couple of other really innovative and interesting programs that the Ministry of Health was implementing at the same time that also had important implications for nutrition and prevention of different problems. And none of them were working across each other's programs or within the existing health system. They were each creating their own information systems, their own management systems, training, hiring their own staff. And in some ways, this allowed them to have administrative expediency, to get things on the ground very quickly, which really was making donors happy, making the president happy. But in the long run, what this was doing was creating a perception at the local level with existing staff who have very deep roots in a lot of these communities and cities. They began to think of this program as something separate. It's not something that I should integrate into my daily activities. And even a short-term intervention, not something that was supposed to become kind of the basis of healthcare in Bolivia, which was the intention of the program. And finally, urban populations really have very different characteristics that make it very difficult to provide them with more preventive types of care. These health staff really, for nutrition programs, really need to establish strong, trusting relationships with families and long-term relationships, at least for the first 2 years of a child's birth and pre-birth, They need to understand the conditions that families are living under. They need to understand their habits, their customs, their access to different services that they might be able to link them to, because this is a very complex issue to resolve. It's not just a health issue. It also involves water, sanitation, often violence. They need to understand beliefs about nutrition. But you can't do that often with this population, because I was especially looking at peri-urban, peripheral, more informal settlements at the edges of cities. These are migrant populations that are moving constantly between the urban and the rural area, going back for harvest times, for migrant work. They are often moving within the city, too, because they rent their homes. Their diets are changing rapidly because now they have access to more high-fat but low-nutrient foods. They also have a lot of their children have to be put into suboptimal daycare or cared for by the 8 and 9-year-old siblings. They don't trust people as much because they don't have the social support networks. There's an incredible mix of customs, all mixing in one neighborhood. All this makes it very difficult for health workers to really get to know the families and understand them. So finally, what this leads me to conclude is that we really need to reconsider urban areas as important, but also really unique sites of action. It takes a different type of work, a different type of approach for working with these populations, especially when you're looking at prevention programs. We need to do more process evaluation and prospective implementation research in urban sites. So the Zero Malnutrition embraced monitoring and evaluation, but they were looking at outputs and outcomes, not so much the logistics, the communication, the supervision system, sustainability. And finally, we need to encourage more adaptive and innovative implementation, especially in these very dynamic urban sites where we don't fully understand how to implement some of these new programs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please join as well. Anthony is commenting. Anthony Kolb. For late arrivals, please be sure to get the biographies because of time constraints. I'm not introducing people in great detail, but you really should know who folks are. Anthony.
Thank you. Thank you, Leslie. What I found this exercise that we've gone through now for 2 years has been really, really useful for me day to day because what I think we found in the papers that have been submitted that they overcome what those in practice often will criticize the academics for, is that they talk about their research, they describe a situation very beautifully, but they stop somewhat short of suggesting how this information can be used and applied in practice. And I think from the first bit of your abstract, Leslie sort of told us that that's not going to be the case with her contribution. And as such, this is a valuable contribution for people like myself that are trying to understand program and develop a better sense of how it should be done right. And so thank you very much for contributing, and I will be borrowing parts of your overhead for my own presentations in the future, I'm quite sure. So besides that general compliment, I have two sort of specific compliments about your paper and contribution, and then a few asks or suggestions for you as you move forward with your work and your career. But first, a little bit of an aside. It's really refreshing also to have this type of interaction with people doing work in Latin America. Unfortunately for USAID, our programming there is so limited that the type of engagement that we have in our more active continents of the world, it's not possible for us to interact with governments quite as extensively as we do in Africa and elsewhere. So I'm very happy to have you share with us this information that we can't get through our day-to-day work. But the compliments I have, and say again why this paper is so refreshing. I was editing a small review of urban health literature that one of our partners was putting out once every quarter. And I just kept throwing aside these papers after papers of descriptive situational analysis and epidemiological studies that would pick out some of the information that you presented in terms of the differences between the special challenges of urban areas. But what tended to fall short of any sort of programmatic analysis of efforts to address those problems. So your work is an extremely valuable contribution to urban health literature. There's way too little programmatic analysis that has been done of efforts to address the problems of the urban poor. So good job in there. Keep pushing at it. It's also, I found, a nice combination of looking at this. Maybe it's just the case, but I think also your analysis, you were looking at sort of a national level policy, higher level political involvement in an issue like this, but also reaching down to the local level in terms of the implementation and the challenges with actually implementing a grand political mandate. Mm-hmm. Which, again, very, very uncommon, I would say, in the literature. And I hope that you can make sure that this is contributed to that literature. A few suggestions are asked, though. The discourse on the differences in the urban situation, the challenges of working in that situation, and so forth, it becomes more compelling and powerful, and it's more receptive to people's ears if you're a little bit more positive in suggesting solutions. I understand that the Bolivia case is probably currently in search of solutions to the challenges that you've highlighted, but to make some suggestions about efforts to adapt in a particular city, what some staff have done differently on their own initiative, and or drawing in examples from other cases, maybe from other countries, in suggesting how they might address some of the challenges that they've identified to you, I think would make for a more compelling paper and communication, something that you might think about as you package this for different audiences. I have to say that I'm an engineer with engineering background and like numbers and quantification. I think some of the case that you make in terms of quantification of the need for resources and it could have been a little bit more compelling. I'm not sure exactly to say what part of that. But again, for a certain number of policymakers, the sort of critique of, well, this is all about numbers and creating these outputs and so forth. Well, we at USAID are certainly victims of the need for political decision makers to have those numbers, to justify these programs, to simply structure them at the national level, to budget them and so forth. So the numbers are important, and and if you sort of have a problem with some of them creating sort of alternative numbers that can be presented to policymakers, I think still is important. And the final one is, I'm simply striving to make sure that your work does fit into the urban health literature, which, granted, is a fairly young literature. There's a Journal of Urban Health. There's only a few years old. There really isn't sort of a language around the discipline yet that hopefully researchers like yourself can contribute to. Issues of dealing with a mobile population, issues of dealing with people that are, sort of estranged in this urban environment. These are common themes throughout. And starting to establish some common language around these challenges and the approaches to dealing with them is, I think, still where the field needs to go. In many areas of public health, you have catchphrases or oftentimes acronyms actually, addressing from health extension workers to other sorts of approaches that when people hear those words, they understand them to be defined in a certain way. I think what you're saying and what I've been saying to many is that we have to sort of redefine some of these approaches and standard practices for the urban environment and for the urban populations that we're trying to target, and start to have those phrases and understanding sort of embedded. It sort of saves us time and helps structure our conversation moving forward. And I think you have a lot of the raw material here, but I hope that in your career you'll continue to reach out to those people. I think it's a rich area. There's a lot of interest in urban health-related work, and so jump in. As your first a credential that you can use in moving forward, I hereby deputize you as a urban health champion.
Thank you.
That is your name.
Thank you.
Welcome to the family.
Leslie, do you have anything you want to add in response, or just?
Well, I didn't actually talk in my presentation about, there are some really exciting, innovative ideas of ways that local staff are taking, there is a large perception and actually a fear in some ways of giving ideas and adapting, but there are some staff that are really remarkable, and some NGOs as well that are doing some really fascinating things. It's in my paper, and I didn't talk about it in my presentation just because of time issues. But certainly, I really am excited about a lot of the ideas that you presented. And the numbers also, just quickly, in terms of the output-oriented approach to the program right now, I'm not criticizing that at all. I think it's really important that they've embraced monitoring and evaluation in the program. The issue is that it's diverted their attention from looking at more of the process part of the implementation. So they can't necessarily explain their numbers and understand why it is urban sites might not be performing as well as many rural sites. And so that's where I want to make sure that as the program is implemented, they have that kind of information to be able to adapt the program better.
Okay. Well, we'll return to these issues, I'm sure, in the discussion. Daniel Rashowski and Chris Williams are next.
Okay, my talk today is entitled The State and Urban Food Insecurity in Post-Apartheid Johannesburg. It's based off of field work I did for my dissertation mainly in 2008 and 2009. I come from a geography disciplinary background, and I just want to, before I begin, thank the organizers for putting on what has been already really interesting and discussing really key topics on urban issues. So my talk today, like I said, is going to be based on research in Johannesburg. How did I get there? Well, like we were just talking about a little bit in the previous talk about urban food security, we've seen really literally explosive action happening in the aftermath of the food price increases in the last, 2007, 2008, and then again more recently, and just an urbanization of poverty more generally. And this made me start to think, what is going on in the urban context in the global South? And for me, I thought, there's obviously a lot of different causal factors at work, but I think one of the things that we're missing in the academic and policy sort of context is this question of institutional structure, something that the FAO was talking about in one of the recent reports on food insecurity in the world. I think it was a 2009 report. So what kind of institutions are involved in procuring and ensuring food insecurity in the urban context? Because I think part of that will really help us prevent this sort of explosions. People kind of say it's an urban tsunami, silent tsunami, and then it comes out of nowhere. But obviously it doesn't come out of nowhere, and I think our inability to understand what institutions are involved is part of the reason that we sort of are surprised when this explosion happens. So I decided to focus my work in Johannesburg for a few key reasons, because obviously I could look at a number of major cities in the global South. Firstly, I think it has a very big regional influence in Southern Africa and in the developing world more generally. Johannesburg always being a key kind of place to look at state and civil societies. Johannesburg always having one of the more active civil societies in the global South. And, of course, having extreme levels of inequality in food insecurity, something that the other two presenters talked about in their locations as well. So what were the two kind of key research questions which I wrote about in my paper? Basically, trying to understand at the most basic level what food security programs run by the state exist in Johannesburg, and how effective have these programs been in their implementation and overall approach. Again, like the previous speaker said, in this urban context, there really isn't a lot of research on food security. In South Africa, people hear food security, they think rural development. So again, there's that kind of lack of understanding about, actually there is food security going on in cities, and it's extremely problematic. And then secondly, what do these government programs indicate about the South African state approach to food insecurity in the urban context? And then, of course, what does that say sort of not only about its approach more generally, but also potential programmatic limitations? So what did I do in my field work? The few basic methods. And again, this is part of a broader dissertation, so there are a whole host of methods, but specific to the question of the state and urban food security. I did interviews with key government administrators, people in the food business sector, and also people in civil society, NGOs, community-based organizations. And then I also did an analysis of core government policy documents to kind of understand what exactly was going on, again, in this urban context in Johannesburg. And what we find is actually there is a lot of state programs in the urban context in Johannesburg. And I'm just going to run through them very fast. There's direct food assistance. We're talking about supplements for those maybe with debilitating diseases, school feeding programs. Probably the most important program is the social grants. When I actually calculated social grants, over 90% of spending for food security programs in Johannesburg were social grants. And again, this is giving money to, let's say, elderly, people with young children, vulnerable populations. And then they can, again, obviously spend that money to buy food. Urban agriculture gets a lot of publicity in the news, but actually relatively small in the Johannesburg context. Only about 9% of people in Johannesburg in a recent survey actually conducted urban agriculture. And more than that, the failure rate was actually extremely high. In a recent study, 95% of those gardens started actually failed, and there's a whole host of reasons why that happened. Job creation in Johannesburg, very important, particularly leading up to the World Cup. Huge public works projects, employing millions of people, very important. There are some food price controls. There's a council that's set up to actually monitor the food price in South Africa, but again, we have to critique that. What role has it played in terms of actually keeping prices at a reasonable level? Hasn't really happened. And then the last major program that I found was the funding to civil society organizations, and this was through competitive applications and direct contracts. So these are the 6 major programs that I found. And what we find is, so shifting now to a little bit more of the results, that there's an extreme lack of coordination. It's pretty hard to read this, isn't it? And that's kind of the idea here, is that there's so many different departments operating urban food security programs. Nobody wants to kind of give up their power to implement their particular program. So unfortunately, all this money is being spent on urban food security, but what is actually happening? There's not a coordination, and what's the impact of all these programs? So that's something that's very problematic. And people within government actually told me that. They said, there's a black hole on the question of urban food security. We don't really have a policy which kind of brings everything together. Some said, that working in silos, or that we have interdepartmental blinkers. A second kind of limitation that I found was ineffective institutions. So very often these institutions giving money, let's say, to civil society organizations were corrupt. They had very inefficient processes of giving out the money. Also, for a lot of these organizations, the civil society organizations needing grant writing experience, well, they didn't have that. They may not have language problems, et cetera. They couldn't access the funds. Also, a third problem, a limitation I found, was a disconnectedness from on-the-ground realities. A lot of people in government meant well, but their background was from a large agribusiness context. Often white people with this background from the apartheid years, some of them stayed on, then having to go to mainly black townships. So there was a kind of dynamic with race going on, but also simply that they didn't understand how to grow food on a small-scale context, because their knowledge base was from this large agribusiness background. So something else that I found. Like the previous speaker said, I also think there's a lack of urban food security policy more generally. Again, the silent tsunami of urban food security. In the urban context, people are food insecure for different reasons than they are in rural areas. In the cities, people mainly purchase their food. So food prices are very important. There's also very distinct roles for women. There's very distinct migration patterns. There's a lot of different processes going on which are distinct from rural food insecurity. And then lastly, a last kind of weakness I found was corrupt electioneering practices. And I have two examples here. One was people simply couldn't create urban food security gardens in a lot of the township locations because the ward councilors controlled the land access and they wouldn't give them the land. But I thought a more interesting example, and what you see here in this political cartoon, just before the elections in 2009 when Zuma was elected, the ANC appropriated a huge amount of money for the Social Relief of Distress program, one of the social grant programs. And they basically were very direct. They said, you know, we want to win, give people food. And so what you see in this cartoon is literally kind of this kind of questioning about, well, our food program is being co-opted here just to earn votes. Okay, so I've gone through kind of what programs exist, what kind of problems I saw. So what are kind of moving more towards my conclusions? What do we make of all this? Firstly, I kind of asked this question, especially given the last slide about the corruption question. Who are these food programs for? Some in the more critical perspective say, well, you know, what might be happening here is the food price crisis that happened numerous times, 2001, 2002, 2007, 2008, and keeps happening, gives the government an opportunity to ramp up its food security programs for its own gain. But that's more of an open-ended question, open to interpretation. Also, we have to ask, what's the relationship between state and civil society here? What's really interesting is that South Africa has one of the most active civil societies in the world. It has in the apartheid years and also in the post-apartheid years. And there's all these basic social movements for the right to live in a clean place, a sanitary place, a place with electricity. But we don't really see a really solidified social movement based on food. And I kind of asked the question, why? What's distinct about this? Why is this not happening? And I think that's a question that really begs for something in more future research. So my last slide here, given the last discussion about, well, what can we do? You know, rather than just critique, how can we move forward? And so I think that, you know, rather than falling back into these grand narratives of, well, we have, you know, a neoliberal state where the government is shirking its responsibilities, or that we have a corrupt state, I think in the South African context, we have more of a hybrid state situation. You know, there is a safety net that exists, and in some ways that's a distinct kind of thing from other developing world context. And I think kind of really taking the complexity seriously is extremely important rather than just making these kind of simple overall arguments. So what I kind of suggest here is I think that some of the programs that exist should continue to be supported. Public Works has been very positive. It takes a lot of money from government, but it actually makes a huge impact. Support for social grants, direct food assistance. Some of these programs work. I think that there also needs to be more government investment in small-scale basic needs community-based organizations. Again, these community-based organizations in the townships are the ones that are really doing a lot of the work on the ground, and they need to be funded well and be taken seriously by the government. The government also needs to invest more seriously, I think, in small-scale agriculture. Again, I was giving that contrast with this sort of agribusiness, large-scale versus this small-scale urban gardening kind of question. And so lastly, I just want to say that in terms of future research, I think what my case and the other two presenters' cases really force us to think about is doing more multi-scalar research in an interurban comparative kind of context, where we're comparing urban contexts in these developing world contexts. How can we do that? And we also need to know how can state urban food security policies interact with informal livelihood strategies in the informal settlements of the Global South, since this is going to be what previous discussants said, the growth area in the developing world is going to be these informal settlements. So we need to identify the place-specific ways that local communities can test and negotiate these different processes at these different scales. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're joining us next to Chris. Chris, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Blair, and thank you, Danielle. I wish we had the luxury of the full dissertation. I think what you've probably done here is attempted to capture a subset of what you've done, and some of my comments are going to touch on what I didn't see, which I was expecting, but I think they're probably somewhere else in your dissertation, so I'll touch on that. But let me give some initial overall reactions to the text and sort of follow the previous speakers of the broader context and the issues that this is dealing with. First, I'd like to compliment the people who reviewed the various 70 papers. You've got Asia, Latin America, and Africa, good regional diversification. And I think what's very important here, especially in the last two presentations, is you've touched on issues that are perceived to be rural but are very much taking place in urban settings. So if we look at the health issue and the food issue, the last two presentations were essentially getting out of the urban box. We're looking at a whole set of issues that are really national in scope, but they have very particular urban manifestations and challenges that I think the two presentations have shown we really need to get our head around and understand better, not only in terms of context, but in terms of policy and programming. A third observation is, wow, I think every sub-Saharan African country would be really happy with the problems that South Africa has. You've got lots of programs. The problem is coordination. You didn't have to go through structural adjustment. The state is still there. You haven't had a decimated state, which is sub-Saharan Africa is what you have, with a complicated process of international NGOs and local NGOs and lots of development assistance money, official development assistance that is essentially filling the space of service delivery. You've got a lot of this going on in South Africa that's not external, it's endogenous, and the issue is how do these different layers of government and different programmatic interventions work in a more effective way. I just want to underscore that in the global context, South Africa is really in the kind of problems that it's struggling with are very real, as you've outlined, but they're in a way the kind of problems that a lot of countries would like to have. Too many programs, a bit of corruption and patronage systems, ways in which there needs to be tighter organization of public support and better leverage of those resources from both perspective of private sector and community initiative. The fourth broad observation, I think, is there are many parallels that strike me as someone here in the United States that are relevant. One of the challenges with food security in the U.S. To address the coordination problem has been the establishment of urban food security councils, which in a sense try to bring together the different players in a given city and put forward a common agenda in the absence of a policy and put pressure on the state for a more coherent approach. It would seem with this many actors in Johannesburg already on the ground and active, this might be something to take up as a way to address. And I think parallels what you sort of ended off with in terms of a place-based strategy, as Anna Marie, who's here from HUD, and others working on these issues in the United States. This is the challenge. This is probably the central most signature item of this administration is how to be much more effective at place, not only in drawing on local actors, but using that as a way to drive the support of external resources. And in the case of the U.S., trying to bring together EPA, Department of Housing and Urban Development, Department of Energy, Department of Transport, in a much more coherent and locally driven process. I think these are themes that would touch very clearly in the South African context, and I think there's room for even exchange of ideas. And these are my broader comments on the context, and I think your paper really touches on that. I'm going to shift gears now and be much more of an academic for the remaining 3 minutes and try to dig a bit in terms of how to strengthen this work. And if I sound like some of your faculty members, I apologize, and if I'm restating the obvious, but it just struck me reading this that there are a number of ways. One is what I didn't get was a good definition of what food security is and food insecurity is. How would you define that? What would be indicators to measure it? If we're looking at program effectiveness, a lot of us here are under enormous pressure from our respective organizations to show evidence and show impact. One of the things that I'm sure South Africa would be under pressure to do as it moves forward in this direction to try to coordinate its initiatives is to look more clearly at, are we talking about the number of meals someone has per day? Are we talking about the quality of the food that they've had? Are we talking about access to food? If so, what kinds? I think, it's a short paper, so it's hard to address all that, but some working definition of food security and what is not secure, is insecure, would be a helpful start. The second would be the unit of intervention. I think part of the South African experience has been to move away from very segregated micro-municipalities to the metro. And this has been a long and challenging struggle in South African context. It seems to me that this is looking broadly at the greater metro of Johannesburg. It might be interesting to unpack the different levels of municipalities so that we look at the reach and effectiveness of food security programs as they pertain to a central business district, to the three metros that constitute Johannesburg, the wider metropolitan area, because it's touching on agricultural production and often the link. When we talk about in the U.S. context metro, we often talk about core, suburban, and greater rural hinterland to capture the relationship between food production and food consumption and a broader stretch of trying to integrate those. Know your farmer, know your food is sort of the mantra that we're trying to push in the U.S. I think the third area of improvement would be to sharpen the conceptual framework. I think implicitly you have it in this page that you showed here in terms of the number of types of initiatives and the number of levels of intervention from national, provincial, and municipal and down to civic. It would seem helpful at some point to look at the kind of conclusions that you've addressed in terms of effectiveness, in terms of the practical realities on the ground, in terms of coordination, the uneven access to resources, to step back and say, okay, are these essentially the things that are causing urban insecurity, the absence of these, and would enhancing each of these things be really the way towards better food security? So some level of causation between food assistance, social grants, urban agricultural support, job creation, food price controls, funding of civics, and how these impact on food security, and how they're mediated through the different institutional layers. I think doing some modeling in this would help sharpen both the understanding of the problem and potentially attract solutions. Once you do that, I think the fourth level is what I was lacking is we're sort of dealing in 2000 to 11. So much history in South Africa that has created the kind of conditions that you would have in food insecurity. And here I'm talking about not only the change in the metropolitan, but also the shift from the civics going from outside of the state and challenging apartheid to be integrating into the government. What happened with that human capital loss in terms of community-based organizations, NGO sector? What's happened now after there's sort of been a reaction to that and a rebuilding of those institutions? How have state-society relations changed, and how does that impact on the effectiveness of government interventions, particularly when they are looking at disbursements of resources and approaches through civic institutions? The fifth and last point would be simply, you touched just in your presentation on agribusiness people sort of being the ones that are in positions of providing technical assistance to farmers. What that triggered for me is a deeper understanding of the political economy of food production. What's happening in South Africa? Is this largely large-scale agribusiness? Is the source of food production? What's the breakdown of large-scale versus medium, and then, as you had said, in terms of the micro-farms in the both at the community level and the household level? What's happening in that context in terms of the supply of food, the price of food, the quality of food, and the processing of food? These are broad, and I'm trying to keep time. I hope I'm okay with my 8 minutes, but like I said at the beginning, I'm sure that if I had the whole dissertation, all of this would be answered. We just had only the one paper in front of us, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
Daniel,
Thank you for the comments. Yeah, a lot of the questions that you raised were addressed in the dissertation, but also you brought up some other interesting points. I think that I want to highlight now, but then also as I kind of work and towards publication with some of the dissertation materials, et cetera. So the first question I think about, well, why South Africa? I think to some extent South Africa, and this is an open-ended question, to what extent can or should it be sort of an ideal type or something to work towards in a Southern African context or developing country context more generally? You know, sometimes people look at places like Brazil and say, well, what have they done there, or even in Bolivia? And I think for all of our research, all three of us, it's, what does this mean for other contexts? So I think, is South Africa, the model that they have, what we want to work towards? And I think it's a really difficult question to answer that, but I think that's a critical one, because given South Africa's relative strength in the Southern African context, I think people do implicitly look towards it as a model. Measuring food security, what is food security? I think that's, I can give you a nice and tidy definition, using all the nice lingo, but then, like you said, how do we measure it? I mean, that's a really difficult kind of question when you kind of operationalize and kind of apply that kind of abstract concept. So something I'm still working through. And some of these other comments about the different scales, I mean, since I come from geography, I take that very seriously about, like you said, the various micro scales and metro scales and national scales, and that's something that's touched a little bit more in the dissertation. But I just want to end by saying that the interesting thing about the community-based organizations in South Africa, like you were saying, is that they really were getting resources mainly from outside South Africa to then topple the apartheid regime, very important kind of resource flows. Then after South Africa develops the state, the civics say, well, we will kind of work with the state, and then, like you were saying, there's been a reaction to that, and now a lot of them have broken off and very much against what the state's doing. And what I found in my research is that actually there's an extreme polarization of the sector. You have these large NGOs which are well-financed by domestic and international sources, and then unfortunately you have these community-based organizations really struggling in the townships, and they're the ones, again, that are doing that day-to-day work and know food security the best. And so unfortunately, I think that, and that may be something we'd see in other cities as well, and it's something that, that's why I was ending there, saying that I think the state really needs to infuse some resources into these community-based organizations in the townships, because they know what's going on, since they literally live next to people who are extreme food insecurity. So I'll just end there.
Okay,
Thanks.
thank you. Why don't you both stay there, and we'll ask the other panelists to join us, and we have about a half hour for discussion.
Thanks. Yeah, sure. Yeah, this is, oh, great. Oh, excellent with it.
Well, let me just throw it open and see if there are any questions, comments, observations. We'll go right to the back of the room, and then keep your hands up. I'm going to take a kind of note, but we'll go there, and then we have 1, 2, 3. Okay.
I think. Okay. Hi. Just a response to a kind of a call for the need for context in this. Was really thinking about this with regards to the urban poor, with reference to the second set of Leslie and Anthony's points. Particularly the one that really stayed with me is Anthony's important point about the need for U.S. aid, and I think other development agencies, for numbers, for political reasons. I'm going to give you an example of a health prevention program that looks to be working and has been touted as such. And I think the numbers, skewed in a certain way, look like it's working. The research I was doing with urban youth suggests that not only is it not working, that the situation that what underlies it and explains the reason why it isn't working is the thing that is much more difficult to address. What I'm talking about, there's a book that's coming out called Stuck on Youth in Rwanda, and half the book is on urban youth. Rwanda has had one of the highest rates of urbanization in the world for about 15 years. And so what's the reference point here? Ordinary youth that were researched, this was originally a World Bank study, ordinary youth in the capital had no interest in the HIV/AIDS prevention programs. In fact, most of them didn't even know about them. And the point that I'm trying to make here is the numbers can't work here because the level of utter fatalism among this population was profound and so widespread that the rates of HIV prevalence in this population have to be significantly, many times more than what's estimated by these facts and figures. And what I'm just pointing, I'd just like to get your sense of the importance of context, because this emphasis, which I understand from Anthony, is very true on numbers, on quantitative facts. The case that I learned with urban youth really opened my eyes to the extraordinary need for context and understanding things like urban health prevention. Thank you.
Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try to take a couple more people. We'll come down here. I think we have the three paper authors are all people who focus on context, so I think you will get a response. But let's take a second question. Then we'll come up, and then there's still people on the list.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rosemary Seguero. I'm the president of Hope for Tomorrow. I focus on job creation through entrepreneurship. I work with university students who have no jobs back in. I come from Kenya. And I thank you all young people for this wonderful presentation. What he has said on South Africa, all of you, is very, very true. What the government needs to do is to work with CPOs, work with civil society, and who know what the problem of people are. Even in the urban area, I don't know if one of you have been to Kenya in the rural areas, and not in the urban area where we have slums. You find, recently I attended the annual meeting at the World Bank, IMF. I was asking Habitat, why are those slums there? People looking at those slums and people who live there. So what can they do? But your presentation, all your presentations have been so much great, and I just thank you as young people for looking. I think young people of today, if they went to the head of states and leaders like the way you've talked, I think you can change the world. So what you have said, especially on Africa, in South Africa, is not only South Africa, it's the whole of Africa. That's what happens, exactly what you have said. You seem as if you have been in all of Africa. So thank you so much for your presentation, and I would like you to have your contact so that you can work with and communicate with the students we work with in Africa. Thank you.
Okay. Let me squeeze one more in the back, and then we'll come up to the paper givers.
Nancy Chumovic from Cardno EMG. My question is directed at the Pakistan case. Punjab is an area with particular cultural proclivities. How can one go about generalizing some of the things that you have pointed out, even to other parts of Pakistan, whether it's Quetta or Karachi or Peshawar, wherever?
Okay. I think these actually three questions they revolve all around questions of context. So maybe we'll start with Pakistan, since there was a specific question. We'll ask each of the authors to respond.
In case of Lahore, I think the situation is certainly not unique. What we see as far as tenure security arrangements and perceptions held by residents, it's been documented elsewhere in Africa and South America. It's not. I think what is most important in Lahore's context is the role government officials play. And the perceptions held by residents, I think, is not unique. It's been seen elsewhere. But what makes this case unique is the role of the local government, the chief ministers, the whole drive for regularization in Punjab for all squatter settlements in Punjab. That was the chief minister's decision. Now that wasn't taken up by any other province. So in Karachi, the role of the government is completely different from what we see in Punjab, because Karachi is in a different province. So as far as residents' perceptions and their circumstances are concerned, I think the situation is not unique, but the role of the government and how it is responding to the residents' circumstances is is different from other cases. But we can definitely generalize, I think, because the set of circumstances that influence perceptions of security are important, and there are lessons to be learned about titling and what the government should do as far as providing a sense of security to the residents is concerned. So in that sense, it speaks to the theory of tenure security, but the context can be generalized to other cities.
Okay. Daniel, why don't you go next?
Yeah, I mean, I think these are three excellent questions, and something that I struggle with in my research is, maximizing the generalizability, but at the same time having the context fully there. People have been talking about, how can you, with South Africa's really particular history, and how can you then generalize that and say that it's a valuable case study to compare to other contexts? And I think that's the challenge. And one thing I was thinking about is, I'm coming from an academic perspective, but to what extent is this generalizability question looked at by people in the policy world and the nonprofit world, and then also people maybe in civil society? So what disjunctures or what kind of differences are there between the ways that we are thinking through, since to some extent, we're talking today about trying to bridge that gap between academics and people in different circles. To what extent can we and should we be thinking in similar ways about that? Because I can tell you in South Africa, there's been a lot of work recently comparing South Africa to India and Brazil. Middle income, kind of so-called emerging economies, extreme inequality. Is that something we should be doing? What's the value of doing that? And in some ways, I see South Africa being compared to Brazil and India more than I do some countries within Africa or Southern Africa. Is that valuable? Are we moving in the right direction there? So that's something that that kind of particular versus generalizability, the context versus generalizability, kind of a tension that I think we all have to work through. So, thanks.
Leslie?
I'm not sure exactly what. I don't know if I understood the question quite accurately, but two things that it made me think about was that in Bolivia they are doing a midterm evaluation of the program, and so in terms of, if you're asking in terms of whether the program's working and wanting numbers for that, should be coming out pretty soon. But a real problem in terms of data has been having so many parallel systems of data collection that it's very confusing to know which one really is the most valid data source to be using to really see if the program is having an impact. It does seem to be working to a certain extent, especially in the rural municipalities where they've been focusing. But in terms of context, I mean, that's something I'm very committed to and focused first at the local level to try to understand across different rural as well as urban sites, 3 different cities that are very diverse, and actually 5 rural municipalities in two different departments of the country, to try to understand also how regional supervisors influence local staff, and also spoke to program participants and local health promoters to really understand the unique situation of each of these different sites, to see if there is anything you can generalize across them, but also to understand how local staff are trying to adapt to very unique realities. So I'll go into a lot of detail in my dissertation on that.
Okay, I have 2 people on the list. We'll go to David, then we'll come down here. Are there any? And okay, we'll take 3 questions and come back the same.
David Painter. I have 2 very quick questions. The first is a broad question, which I'd be interested in the response from any or all of you, and that is, I was struck by the use of the term rural bias, having lived with urban bias as shibboleth, if you will, for so long. It's refreshing to hear the words rural bias. And what I'm curious about, and particularly, Ms. Oye, if you could address it in the context of your research, to what extent do you think that rural bias exists because of what donors are pushing. And, you know, are the donors significant in this regard, or is it really more fundamentally the national policymakers in the countries where they're working that are pursuing that rural bias? So that's the first question. The second question is much more detailed, and just one I'm fascinated about because I knew Lahore a very long time ago. And your first diagram of the community showed how in 2010 a road was pushed right through the middle of it. And what I'm very interested in is what happened to the feeling of tenure security before versus after that road ripped through the community and wiped out homes of probably looked like 30 or 40%. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to keep going on the questions right here.
Thank you. Patricia Fagan, Georgetown University, and my question follows very directly from the last question. I concur on the point of rural bias on the part of the donors because of my own research in the area, which has been in the area of reintegrating war-torn populations, that is, populations that were once rural and have become urban through no will of their own, but are now populating many of the major cities in many of the war-torn, in many conflict-ridden countries. And I'm really happy to hear the acknowledgement on the part of the panelists that there is a certain tension between the rural development movement to get rural areas re-established and the urban need, and really accompanied by what I've seen in my research, ill will towards people who are in the urban area, feeling they don't really belong there. They belong back in the rural area from whence they came. I also think that, but what I wanted to focus on was the smaller urban areas. There's been although Leslie's, and this is most relevant to what Leslie has mentioned but not really discussed, most of the discussion has been on the very, very large cities, not very, very large, the larger cities where the problems are acute, just as you've described. But I'd like to know more about research in the smaller municipalities. I'm not talking about rural villages, I'm talking about municipalities, which I've seen, and I suspect, I've not done research on it, but although I'd like to, I suspect that this is a perhaps congenial environment for better food security, better land tenure, better housing, shelter security, and generally better conditions for a population that is of rural origin. Because the usual migration pattern in any event is from rural area to a middle-sized or small-sized city where there is absolutely nothing to a much larger city. Thank you.
Okay,
Sorry
thank you.
so long.
And the final question in this round, yeah.
Thanks, Blair. I'm Larry Hanna. First, let me start by congratulating the Wilson Center and your institutional partners in this whole project. I think all of us coming today are pretty amazed by the results, and I know what it's like to review 70 projects and pick 3 winners, so I suspect there are many more that we would enjoy just as much. What impressed me, not only good discussions and good presentations, but what was said early was the practical nature of the outcome of each piece here. My specific question is, or suggestion is actually for Leslie. Tony asked you to be more positive about possible solutions. And when I looked at your presentation, which I enjoyed enormously, I thought maybe one of the areas that could contribute or you could use as a lens to look at this would be from public finance, and particularly that part of public finance that allocates resources on a per capita basis and pays a lot of attention to cost effectiveness. That seems to me to be a candidate for addressing Tony's question to you. Thank you.
Okay, what I'm going to do is, I think Leslie has 2 specific questions and Fatima has 1. We'll have you respond to those questions, and then I'm going to ask every panelist to respond to the issues of rural bias and research in smaller areas, because I know there's a lot of thinking about these issues here. But Leslie, why don't we give you first a chance to respond to the specific questions?
Yeah, I like the idea a lot of looking at public finance. It was an area when I actually started working in Bolivia in 2007, and that's something that I wanted to look into that I didn't have a chance to look at when I was doing other work there on the same program. But it's an area I've realized too that I really need to understand better and look at more closely. So I can't respond to it right now, but it's certainly something that I'll look into more. And this idea, I think the other question about the smaller cities was directed at me. it depends on what size you mean. One of the cities I looked at is about 200,000 people, where the other ones are 1 million each. One is almost 2 million if you look at La Paz and El Alto combined. And the 200,000 city is Potosí. I think it's maybe less about size than really the context. Again, Potosí is in the highland area. It's the poorest city in Bolivia. It's the poorest region of Bolivia. And one nutrition survey that the nutritionist did there that was very well done really concerned the national coordinators of the program, because it showed about 60% of children were chronically malnourished, which is just outrageous, compared to the other numbers in rural areas or other cities. And so it's actually facing many more problems rather than the ease of trying to address issues of food security, and for a number of different reasons that I really can't go into. But I think you're right that there's a number of other cities that I could look at that are smaller that it would be very interesting to include.
Okay, we're going to ask about the highway next, but when we get to you, Leslie, there was a question about donor-driven versus national rural bias, which will be part of the general discussion. Go ahead.
There was no way for me to know what their perception was before the rule was constructed, but I got the sense from speaking to the residents that was the reason why they felt the government will do whatever it wants to do whenever it wants. And a lot of those, I spoke to some of the residents who had to be evicted. They moved right back after the highway was constructed. Their places of employment are very close by. They have these social links and the social capital within the settlement. They didn't want to move. So what they did was, right 2 days before they had to leave their house, they went and got the title, and then they got compensation, because with the title comes that particular benefit. They got the compensation, and then with that money, they came right back to the same settlement and made little shacks right next to the highway. And they continue to live there like that. They say the compensation is not enough to find land elsewhere and build a house from scratch, and this is the only thing they can afford. But for them, the title meant really nothing, and they said we just got some money out of it, and that's it. But it gave them the perception that we're just anthills in the way of the government doing whatever it wants to do.
And now maybe we'll start with you and move this way on issues of rural bias and how, where it comes from, how powerful is it, urban, and is the discourse on urban bias a response to discourse on rural bias, and also on the issue of city scale and size. Are smaller cities perhaps more effective and efficient research sites and policy sites? Fatima, do you have anything you want to add on those questions, or no?
Well, in Lahore's case, the city is growing at a very, very fast pace, and it seems that the local government is it's just helpless. It doesn't know what to do. Most of the money spent on areas that are for middle and higher income groups. So as far as infrastructure and basic service delivery is concerned, poor areas are neglected completely. And so that's just one thing that I would like to add in case of Lahore. But okay. I'll have the other speakers answer the question.
Thank you. A few points. Firstly, I would strongly endorse the need for vastly improved focus on secondary cities, because numerically that's where the bulk of the challenge is going to lie, and of course where the resource constraints are the most extreme. So certainly our work is increasingly on secondary cities. There are many lessons to be shared, and also it helps to think about the system of cities within a national context rather than look at cities individually as though they have the wherewithal to solve which are problems very much in a national context, which of course then takes me into the rural-urban bias. And I must, these questions come from a very solid background, but I think we can do all of ourselves a favor by identifying this as one of the most stale parts of the developmental debate, where we have camps of competition between our poverty versus your poverty. This is not what was in the minds of the questioner, but is often what informs the structure of the debate. And we need to make very clear, not just because of political correctness, but actually because of rigorous analysis, which demonstrates that the solution to rural poverty most probably lies in better urban growth. And once you make that connection, then you hopefully remove the distinction that you can invest in one at the expense of the other, which is what underlies so much of the debate. Certainly, and this comes to the third question, which is whose responsibility is it for setting the national parameters and the priorities? And we must make the same point as we do about the linkages between the two. It must be the primary responsibility of the national authority to set the developmental agenda and not say that they were swayed by development agencies, many of whom, by the way, are significantly out of date in their analysis and in their approach, and who do contribute continually to this polarization of spheres of poverty, whereas really the challenge is the linkages between national poverty rates and economic growth. And when you have that analysis, then you come to the conclusions that getting our cities right becomes a national economic priority, which has huge impacts on the rural areas. And the last point to make is, in terms of the big global debates, how cities grow, which is really what we're talking about, and the secondary and the large, is an issue that has huge impacts in the rural economy because of the way in which land gets consumed and in terms of the degradation that arises from poorly planned urbanization. So this idea that you can compartmentalize both your policies and the consequences of your interventions into urban and rural spheres should be something that we forgot about 30 years ago.
Daniel?
Yeah, I think building off that point, I think it's really, we want to be careful not to simply say, to overdo the sort of urban food security, urban poverty at the expense of the rural. They're both going on, and it's still not even, that's even not enough. You can't just say that there's this and there's that, because what we're saying in the latter part of this discussion is that there's really a multiplicity of urban experiences going on and rural experiences. And so I'm thinking, well, a lot of us are interested, maybe we should or shouldn't be, about this kind of best fit kind of solution, and maybe we should say that there's really not. There's such a multiplicity of experiences going on that, in my case, Johannesburg, maybe we think about other mega cities in other contexts, and maybe we think about, or maybe we shouldn't be, in other secondary cities for other secondary city experiences. So, but then at the same time, you don't want to be lost in the complexity. So we have a multiplicity of experiences, but then how do we, since we're all interested in affecting change at some level, how do we talk about it in a way that people will listen to us and say, well, you're just speaking about a complex world. How am I going to actually implement that? So I think there's a tension there between that kind of question.
Chris? Yeah, I think one helpful way to look at the rural-urban dichotomy, or to try to eviscerate it, which I think is important, is to look at the very real challenge in sub-Saharan Africa, which is rapid urbanization in the absence of economic growth. And the fact that industrialization and manufacturing is not the driving force in much of sub-Saharan Africa, yet you have this rural-to-urban migration. And I think what happens there, if you look through the economy lens, is that it's impossible to separate urban and rural. That disproportionately 50, 60, 70, 80, depending on the country, percent of GDP is generated through some form of agricultural development. So the question is, people are moving to small-scale towns, they're moving to intermediate cities, they're moving to capital cities. What is their economic livelihood strategy? And I think disproportionately it's agriculture. So the question is, how do you build off of that agricultural base to transition into higher forms of productivity? And here we're looking at all aspects of food processing and distribution, which tend to happen in intermediate cities. They don't happen in rural areas. And they generate an enormous number of jobs, but they're happening in cities that are not planned. So thinking through this dynamic, and then, as Billy has alluded to, the real market for food production at scale is going to be in intermediate cities and capital cities. What's the purchasing power of that population? What is the level, as we've heard, of food security coming from there? And what is the basis of transitioning from that kind of agricultural base, looked in a balanced territorial way, towards more higher forms of productivity, whether those are light industry, services, more balance of export and domestic consumption on a whole set of manufactured goods. What's the transition strategy, and where does the city, both capital, intermediate, and small, fit into that strategy of economic growth? I think if you frame this whole discussion of rural-urban in an economic development discussion, you quickly get around, well, it's my poor versus your poor. You're looking at a much more comprehensive strategy of how to move forward in rural and urban areas.
Leslie?
I'll speak more to the case in Bolivia to talk about where maybe a rural bias came into the program that I was looking at. It really is being pushed more by the national government, but you have to think about where they were getting their information to decide where to map food insecurity and malnutrition in the beginning. And they used a very sophisticated model that the World Food Program came up with that I think they've used in other countries that mapped food insecurity across the country using maybe 10 different indicators, and including whether the roads have asphalt on them, and things that actually tended to push the urban municipalities and cities out of the picture, because by their indicators they should have better food security. It was all looking at secondary data that I understand, and then the country the program only in the last year, this is in its 5th year, has really started to realize that the way they looked at malnutrition by looking at each individual municipality, each city by itself, and looking at the percentages of malnutrition in each one, and then choosing the ones that have the highest percentages, it doesn't allow you to see where most of those children across the country are living and concentrated. And the conversation is being promoted both by local and regional supervisors, more local staff that are getting invited to some more participatory types of workshops that keep saying when they get invited. That was a problem for the first few years, that urban staff often didn't exist or weren't being invited often, so they couldn't express to national decision makers that there's a real problem in the urban areas. So they started talking about this issue, and actually I didn't even have urban sites in my study design, even after having worked there for about 2 years, 2007 and 2008, until I went back last year. And this discussion was starting to occur, that there's something unique and there's something important going on in the urban sites. And some of the donors started capturing this idea too, and have really been pushing the idea now as well. But they've also admitted that they were part of the problem in the beginning, and in the past. But now I think it's kind of a merger of local staff and donors really pushing national staff who are really beginning to respond.
Anthony?
The way I think about the bias that exists is, again, it was an interesting paper last year from a political scientist perspective on the sort of the electoral democratic bias that builds up around opposition parties that tend to be in capital cities, and the rural base, which tends to be the home of the ruling party. Those sorts of political dynamics are clearly extremely important for national policy decisions, and I think are part of the ongoing impediments to, say, well thought out urban-oriented policies. But I think day to day in our donor work, a lot of this is just simply professional bias, I think. We're living in a dynamic world where the challenges are changing very rapidly. Rwanda is a good example. And the people that sort of run the organizations that are trying to address these challenges base much of their thinking and experience on their early careers. And there's a generational shift going on, I think, within a lot of development organizations that I think will ultimately address this. But we need to have people with that experience among these populations with these problems and the solutions that actually work for them to start internalizing that and making these connections. And I just bring up, I'm really happy that we were able to focus on food security. Food security is one of the major presidential initiatives under this administration. The one that's probably changing USAID's programming most. And there's a funny mix of biases for different reasons. that don't exclude urban, but don't necessarily directly target it either. And the connection is nutrition. We focus on food security, the outcome as improved nutritional outcomes, really, at the end of the day. But we're doing a lot with agriculture, which is out in the rural areas, working with farmers. But I think ultimately it's going to continue to evolve, and these connections, which are very extremely important, especially if the motivation was food price spikes, which largely affected those that are dependent on food, purchasing food, thus the urban poor. It's just, that big picture is not fully integrated into how we approach this issue at this point. But I think it will be by the end of this effort, and that's exciting to keep an eye on.
Okay, I'm going to invite Jessica up to give the final word. I do have to repeat once again that we have to be out of here at 11. I hope you'll have lots of private conversations, but outside of this room. So, Leslie.
All right, so before we're swept out, would like to thank all of the authors for a really tremendous body of research at the moment. And I think in just our second year of this competition, we've seen a real transformation and a much closer or very, complete match with what we were hoping for, which was looking at academic research and how it can inform policymakers and those of us in the donor community. We have UN Habitat here today. We have Cities Alliance. It's the World Bank. It's USAID who are listening to what you guys have to say. And even just from last year, we've seen a much closer tie to understanding from the research how that can inform and help us understand practically what we might do differently. I would just also like to thank our discussants for your time today and for your thoughtful comments and insightful comments. And I'd like to give a round of applause to our authors and discussants, if we could. I'd also like to quickly thank Nancy and Lauren and Anjali from USAID, Woodrow Wilson Center, and the International Housing Coalition as the folks who really did the bulk of the work in reviewing the papers and organizing this. They did a tremendous job, so a round of applause to them as well. And would just like to close with a few comments. I think we had some, very interesting messages from today. Rural-urban bias, it's a conversation we've been having a long time. And as Tony noted, I'm going to be stealing some of the slides from today where we try to demonstrate from the donor's perspective, data is powerful. We need the data. We base decisions on the data. And right now, certainly at USAID, our administrator is all about the data. We want numbers, numbers, numbers. We need them in order to articulate what we intend to do and how we're going to measure our success. We need to articulate what the problem is and why we're deciding to invest in one area versus another. And we need to be able to say we've achieved something. So the numbers are important. At the same time, we all know numbers can be misleading. Numbers can mask if you disaggregate the data in different ways, if you don't dig a little deeper. Data can be manipulated. It is not neutral. So I think, we heard a lot today about understanding the problem, but being able to understand it deeply in terms of understanding the context and how you might look at the data differently and what that means. So as we go back at USAID, and we're, I think rightly at the moment, being pushed to do more research, to do more evidence-based programming, it also highlights for us some of the risks or the challenges we face to make sure that we do it well and that we do it right and that we understand. And some of my colleagues like to say this all the time, context, context, context. But then again, as noted, we have to balance we need to understand the place-specific issues, but we need to draw the lessons learned, and we should. We need to contextualize it, but we need to understand what that means for elsewhere. So I took the lesson from the South Africa example that USAID does that at a global scale. We take silos and we look at issues. Here's one program, here's one program, here's one program. How do we coordinate them? How do we bring them together and maximize results and create those synergies that we all want to happen? So I think we can take the lessons learned and understand what that means for policymakers. I think the research from Pakistan reiterates a message some of us have been trying to make for a long time, the importance of understanding tenure as a complex issue. It is not just about titling. You need to understand the context, and you need to understand people's perceptions, and at the end of the day, it's about people. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to address the needs of the urban poor. But with the last comment, and I think Billy highlighted this, and it was reiterated by some of the others, especially Leslie, with your last comments, when you talk about individual cities, we are missing the boat a little bit. It is about systems of cities, it's about regions, it's about metropolitan areas, it's about cities and the urban or the rural areas that they're connected to. And when we start talking about that, it all becomes very complex and some people's eyes glaze over, particularly our colleagues on the Hill when we try to explain these issues, because it is very complex. But ultimately, that's what we need to do, and to really understand the challenges and how we get at economic growth and development, which Chris touched on. That's where we want to be. We want to see cities, we want to see rural areas, we want to see national governments embracing urbanization and changing it and managing that process so that they reap the opportunities and the benefits of urbanization. Sub-Saharan Africa is not currently. What can we do to anticipate the growth and embrace the growth so that it is a positive force for change? On Friday of this week, also here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, USAID is sponsoring a Futures Symposium. And one of the trends that we're looking at to understand how USAID can better anticipate and understand where world trends are going in the future, one of those trends is urbanization. I think right now USAID is not very well positioned to respond, but I think this kind of research that we're seeing here today, our partnerships with UN Habitat, with Cities Alliance, Woodrow Wilson Center, International Housing Coalition, the World Bank, etc., allows us to have something to build on. We hope and intend to continue our engagement with the university, so we're really glad that you guys participated this year and hope you'll spread the word so that we have an even better competition next year, so that we can draw from you guys and apply those lessons learned out in the field. So thank you very much, and I think we need to close. Thanks.